mist does not rise, it waits. It hangs heavy and grey over the Balad Valley, pressing down on the earth as if trying to hide what lies broken beneath it. It is the morning of January 10th, 1475, and the world here smells of sulphur, wet wool, and the copper tang of spilled blood that has already begun to freeze into the mud. We are walking through the aftermath of something impossible. A silence that feels heavier than the roar of cannons that preceded it. The ground is uneven, churned into a chaotic tapestry of slush and ice, where the debris of a superpower lies scattered like toys forgotten by a careless giant. Here, a turban of fine silk unravels slowly in a puddle of dark water. There, a shield inlaid with verses from the Quran rests face down in the frozen grass, its gold leaf dull under the winter sky. There is no cheering. The victors are too exhausted, their breath pluming in the frigid air as they lean on their axes and pikes, watching the fog swallow the retreating shadows of the Ottoman army. This is not merely a battlefield. It is a graveyard of certainty. For decades, the Ottoman war machine has been an irresistible tide, sweeping across maps and erasing borders. But here, in this narrow, unassuming valley, the tide has not just been stopped. It has been broken against a rock it did not see. The silence is profound, interrupted only by the caw of a crow or the groaning of a wounded horse. And as you stand here, invisible and safe in the drift of history, you can feel the shift in the air, the sudden, terrifying realization spreading from this valley to the palaces of Istanbul that the world is not as easily conquered as the map suggested. Close your eyes now and let the grey light of the valley fade into the warm darkness behind your eyelids. Let the tension of your own day loosen, uncoiling from your shoulders and your jaw, drifting away like smoke in the wind. You are safe here, floating above the timeline, an observer of ancient struggles that can no longer touch you. Take a deep breath, inhaling the crisp, clean air of the imagination, and let it out slowly, sinking deeper into your mattress, finding the perfect stillness that precedes sleep. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let us return to the silence of the valley. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must understand the eyes that are looking at it. High above the carnage, the winter sun is trying to break through the low clouds, casting a pale, sickly light on the devastation. This was the Battle of Vaslui, a clash that historians still argue whether it represents the greatest defeat of Islam in the medieval period, or simply the most shocking tactical upset of the 15th century. But for the men lying in the mud, definitions do not matter. The Ottoman soldiers who marched here were the elite, the Janissaries, men who had seen the walls of Constantinople crumble, men who believed in their own invincibility because history had given them no reason to doubt it. They marched into Moldavia expecting a punitive expedition, a harsh lesson taught to a rebellious vassal. But they found themselves drowning in a landscape that hated them. The aftermath we are witnessing is the result of a collision between imperial pride and a brilliance that was cold, calculated, and entirely without mercy. The man who orchestrated this silence is not standing atop a pile of bodies screaming for glory. He is somewhere in the distance, washing the soot from his hands, already writing letters, already planning the next fortification. This is Stephen, voivode of Moldavia, and the silence he has created here is different from the silence left by his cousin, Vlad Dracula. When Dracula fought, he left behind a tableau of horror, a theater of stakes designed to make men vomit with fear. But when the shock wore off, the empire regrouped, anger replacing terror. Here, at Vaslui, the feeling is different. It is not horror. It is a profound, unsettled dread. The Ottoman commanders, those who escaped the slaughter, are not just frightened, they are confused. They have been outmaneuvered, outthought, and systematically dismantled by an enemy who used the fog, the mud, and the timing of the universe itself as weapons. As we drift over the battlefield, looking down at the scattered standards of the Sultan, we realize that this fear is more dangerous because it is rooted in respect. You can kill a monster, like the vampire of legend, with a stake and a prayer. But how do you kill a fog? How do you kill a winter? How do you kill a prince who fights like a mathematician, solving the equation of your destruction before you have even drawn your sword? The bodies here are not displayed for shock. They simply fell where they were outwitted. The Ottoman Empire, a sprawling giant stretching its limbs across 3 continents, has just stubbed its toe on a sharp, jagged stone in the north, and the pain is shooting all the way up the spine of the state. It is a pain that whispers a warning. Terror can be endured, but competence is existential. The wind picks up, rustling the dry reeds at the edge of the marshes, a sound like thousands of dry whispers discussing the fall of the mighty. It is a lullaby of the aftermath, a reminder that all storms eventually end, leaving only the quiet earth and the stories we tell about it. We are drifting back now, moving away from the immediate scene of the victory, rewinding the clock to understand how we arrived at this frozen morning. To understand why Stephen became the true nightmare of the port, we must first understand the shadow he walked in, the long, bloody shadow of the man the world remembers far better. We must look south, across the Danube, to the land of Wallachia, where fear was not a strategy, but a language. We must go back to the legend of the Impaler, not to revel in his darkness, but to see why, in the eyes of the Sultan, he was merely a storm, violent and passing, while Stephen was the coming of winter itself. The fog swirls around us, thick and white, dissolving the scene of Vaslui, carrying us on a current of memory toward a different kind of darkness, a darkness lit by torches and smelling of smoke. We travel back in time, drifting south, leaving the triumph of the Moldavians behind to witness the terror that came before, the terror that taught the Ottomans the difference between a nightmare and a nemesis. The air grows warmer, heavy with the scent of pine and charcoal, as we cross the invisible line between the lands of the effective and the lands of the horrific. We are moving towards the reign of Vlad III, to see the face of fear that the world knows, so that we can better recognize the face of the fear that the world forgot. The journey is gentle, a smooth glide through the corridors of the past, preparing us to compare the fire of the dragon with the stone of the saint. To understand the chill that eventually settled in the hearts of the Ottoman pashas when they looked north, we must first walk through the fire that burned before the frost. We drift south across the Danube into the dense, brooding forests of Wallachia, a land that in the mid-15th century felt less like a kingdom and more like a wound that refused to close. Here, the air feels different, charged with a frantic, nervous electricity, the kind that permeates a house where everyone is afraid to speak above a whisper. We are entering the domain of Vlad III, the man history remembers as Dracula, the son of the dragon. But strip away the cinema, the capes, and the fangs, and you find something far more tragic and human. A man obsessed with order in a world that offered him only chaos. Vlad did not rule. He survived. His reign was a series of violent spasms, a constant, breathless attempt to force stability onto a nobility that betrayed him and an empire that sought to swallow him. If Stephen's Moldavia was a fortress of stone, Vlad's Wallachia was a cage of iron bars, forged in paranoia. Imagine walking through his capital, Târgoviște, at night. The streets are unnaturally quiet. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but revealing of the atmosphere, that Vlad placed a golden cup by a public fountain in the town square, allowing anyone to drink, but forbidding anyone to steal it. The cup remained there, untouched, day after day, glittering in the sun and the moonlight, not because his people were honest, but because they were terrified. This was the essence of his power, a fragile peace held together by the absolute certainty of horrific punishment. The Ottomans knew this reputation well. They knew that crossing the Danube meant entering a psychological theater where the rules of war were distorted into something nightmarish. But nightmares, as terrifying as they are, vanish when you wake up. The Ottoman encounter with Dracula reached its zenith in the summer of 1462, a campaign that perfectly illustrates the difference between the fear of a man and the fear of a state. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had brought down the walls of Constantinople, marched into Wallachia with an army that dwarfed Vlad's forces. He came not to destroy the country, but to bring it to heel. Vlad, unable to meet the Sultan in the open field, retreated into the shadows. He burned his own villages, poisoned his own wells, and retreated into the deep forests, leaving the Ottoman army to march through a wasteland of hunger and thirst. It was a strategy of desperation, effective but costly, a king eating his own limbs to save the body. The tension broke on the night of June 17th, 1462, in an event that has been immortalized as the night attack. Picture the scene. The moon is obscured by clouds. The Ottoman camp is a sprawling city of tents, resting in the uneasy silence of a foreign land. And suddenly, the darkness screams. Vlad and his cavalry burst into the camp, torches blazing, slashing their way toward the Sultan's tent. It was a raid born of pure audacity, a lightning strike designed to decapitate the empire in a single stroke. For a few hours, there was absolute bedlam. Horses trampled through the tent lines, men fought shadows, and the night was lit by the erratic flash of steel and fire. It was the kind of moment that creates legends, the dragon breathing fire upon the sleeping giant. But when the sun rose, the reality was laid bare. The Sultan was alive. The Ottoman army, though shaken and bruised, was still massive, still coherent, and still there. Vlad had failed to kill the head of the snake, and he had no second plan. He melted back into the forest, leaving the Ottomans to regroup. What followed is the part of the story usually obscured by the myth. Mehmed II did not turn around and run back to Istanbul screaming. He marched on. He marched all the way to Târgoviște. It was there, outside the city, that he encountered the infamous Forest of the Dead, the grim display of thousands of impaled bodies that Vlad had left as a welcome gift. Historians still argue whether the numbers recorded by Greek chroniclers, 20,000 bodies, were accurate or an exaggeration to enhance the Sultan's eventual triumph, but the effect was undeniable. The sight was sickening. It was a grotesque monument to cruelty that reportedly caused even the Sultan, a man accustomed to the brutality of war, to recoil. But here lies the crucial distinction. The Sultan was not defeated by this sight. He was repulsed. He did not fear Vlad's military competence. He loathed his methods. And most importantly, he saw that Vlad had exhausted his own country. There was no deep loyalty protecting the impaler, no robust network of fortresses, no economic engine to sustain a long war. Vlad was a one-man army, and one man can be replaced. And that is exactly what the Ottomans did. They did not need to conquer Wallachia inch by inch. They simply reached into their retinue and produced Radu the Handsome, Vlad's own brother, who had grown up in the Ottoman court. Radu was charming, diplomatic, and promised a return to normalcy. The Wallachian boyars, tired of the terror, tired of the burnt fields and the constant fear, defected to Radu in droves. Vlad Dracula was not defeated by a greater army. He was defeated by politics. He was chased out of his own country, not by Turkish janissaries, but by his own people, who preferred a vassal's peace to a madman's war. By the end of 1462, the dragon was a fugitive, begging for help in Hungary, eventually imprisoned by his own allies. The Ottoman Empire had solved the Dracula problem in less than a year. They installed a compliant ruler, secured the tribute, and turned their gaze elsewhere. The fear Vlad inspired was sharp, intense, and personal, but it was shallow. It was the fear of a mugger in a dark alley, terrifying in the moment. But once you have escaped, or the police have arrived, the threat is gone. It left no institutional scar on the Ottoman psyche. They did not have to change their military doctrine to fight Vlad. They did not have to bankrupt their treasury. They just had to weather the storm and wait for him to run out of friends. As we leave the dark forests of Wallachia, the lesson becomes clear. Terror is a wasting asset. It burns itself out. It creates enemies faster than it can kill them. For a ruler to truly terrify an empire like the Ottomans, he needs more than stakes and darkness. He needs to be unmovable. He needs to build a state that functions even when the king is sleeping. This is where the story shifts. We move north now, leaving the tragedy of Vlad behind. We cross the Milkov River into Moldavia, where the landscape opens up into rolling hills and rich vineyards, a land that feels older, deeper, and deceptively quiet. The year is 1457. While Vlad is sharpening his stakes, a young man is stepping onto the field of history in Moldavia. He is short, described by chroniclers as having a ruddy complexion and long flowing hair, with eyes that missed nothing. He had watched his cousin Vlad's theatrical wars, and he had learned. He would not be a dragon. He would be a mountain. He would not rely on the shock of the moment, but on the weight of decades. We are about to meet Stephen, and the Ottomans are about to learn that while a monster can be hunted, a great king is a far more dangerous puzzle. The torches of the night attack fade into the distance, replaced by the steady, warm glow of a candle in a fortress tower where Stephen is studying a map, preparing to turn his entire country into a weapon that will never run out of ammunition. The fire of Wallachia fades behind us, its smoke dissipating into the cool, clean air of the north. And as we cross the border into Moldavia, the ground beneath our feet feels harder, more settled. We have left the realm of the theatrical and entered the domain of the permanent. It is the spring of 1457, and the world here is awash in the pale, hopeful green of new leaves, and the sound of rushing water fed by the melting snows of the Carpathians. We find ourselves on the grassy plains of Dereptat, near the fortress of Suceava, where a different kind of history is being written, not in blood, but in solemn oaths. A young man stands before an assembly of boyars, clergymen, and peasants. He is barely 24 years old, short of stature, with a face that contemporary portraits depict as round, serious, and deeply watchful. This is Stephen, son of Bogdan, soon to be Stephen the Great. He has just won the throne in a battle at Dolgest, ironically, with the military assistance of his cousin Vlad Dracula. But as he accepts the crown, he is already shedding the chaotic influence of his relative. If Vlad was a summer storm, violent and unpredictable, Stephen is the slow formation of a glacier, massive, crushing, and reshaping the landscape over lifetimes, not moments. Watch him as he moves through the crowd. There is no manic energy in his eyes, no desperate need to terrify the men kneeling before him. Instead, there is a terrifying calmness, a sense of gravity that seems to pull the room into his orbit. He knows what the Ottomans do not yet understand, that a prince who rules by fear is a prince who rules alone, and a prince who rules alone is easily broken. Stephen intends to rule by system. As the scene shifts from his coronation to the quiet, dusty corridors of the princely court, we begin to see the architecture of this new threat. The silence here is not the silence of a graveyard. It is the silence of a library or a master builder's workshop. It is the sound of scratching quills and the rustle of parchment. Stephen is working. While the Ottoman sultans in Istanbul are gazing at maps of the Mediterranean, dreaming of Rome and Vienna, Stephen is looking at the mud and stone of his own backyard. He understands that Moldavia is a small state trapped between three hungry giants: the Kingdom of Hungary to the west, the Kingdom of Poland to the north, and the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south. To survive, he cannot simply be a warrior. He must be a diplomat, an economist, and an architect. We float through the stone halls of the Suceava citadel, watching the transformation. Under previous rulers, this fortress was a damp, neglected garrison where nobles plotted treason in dark corners. Under Stephen, the windows are open to the light, the walls are reinforced, and the air smells of mortar and fresh timber. He is obsessed with stone. He knows that wooden palisades burn when the Turks bring their fire arrows. But stone endures. He begins a massive project that historians still argue whether it was a stroke of military genius or a crippling economic burden on the peasantry. The fortification of the entire principality. He does not just build one castle. He builds a network. From Chilia and Cetatea Alba on the Black Sea coast to Hortin in the north and Nahums in the west, he is cinching a belt of granite around his country. Listen to the sound of the hammers ringing out across the valleys. Clink, clink, clink. A rhythmic, hypnotic heartbeat of preparation. It is the sound of a country locking its doors. This is not the behavior of a vassal preparing to submit. It is the behavior of a man preparing for a siege that he expects to last for decades. But Stephen's most dangerous construction is not made of rock. It is made of people. In Wallachia, the boyars were kingmakers, treacherous and powerful, constantly switching sides to preserve their wealth. Vlad tried to solve this by killing them. Stephen solves it by making them irrelevant. He promotes the lesser nobility, the razusheshi, small landholders, who owe their status solely to him. He creates a new class of soldiers who are loyal not to a feudal lord, but to the crown. It is a slow, quiet revolution. There are no forests of stakes here, no public displays of torture to shock the ambassadors. There is simply the steady, ruthless application of law. When a boyar betrays him, the execution is swift, legal, and largely private. It is frighteningly sane. This sanity is what makes him so formidable. The Ottoman spies sending reports back to the port describe a prince who is small in body but great in counsel, a phrase that dismisses him as a minor nuisance. They do not see the danger. They see a pious man who builds churches. Stephen famously founded a monastery for every battle he won, a vow that would eventually dot the Moldavian landscape with painted sanctuaries. But they mistake his piety for passivity. They do not realize that for Stephen, faith is part of the fortification. He is uniting his people under a banner that is both spiritual and national, creating a morale that is harder to break than any wall. We sit now in the corner of his council chamber, watching the candlelight flicker over his face as he dictates a letter to the King of Poland. The hour is late, and the rest of the castle is asleep, but Stephen is awake, his mind moving like a chess player predicting moves 10 turns ahead. He is offering fealty to Poland, not because he wants a master, but because he needs a shield against Hungary while he deals with the Turks. Next year, he might switch his allegiance to Hungary to balance against Poland. He is fluid, pragmatic, and entirely without sentimental loyalty to foreign crowns. His only loyalty is to the survival of the state. This is the silence of Stephen the Great, the quiet years of the 1460s and early 1470s, where he is not fighting great wars, but building the engine that will fight them. He is gathering powder, stockpiling grain, training the peasantry to use the scythe and the bow, and mapping every ravine, every swamp, and every forest path in his domain. He is memorizing his country so that when the enemy comes, the land itself will fight alongside him. The Ottomans, accustomed to the erratic outbursts of crusaders and the fragile egos of feudal knights, have no framework for a man like this. They are used to enemies who want glory. Stephen does not want glory. He wants security. Glory is a flash in the pan. Security is the stove that keeps the house warm through the winter. As the camera pulls back from the window of the citadel, leaving the prince to his late-night work, we see the lights of the villages below, flickering like stars in the valley. The people sleep soundly, unaware of the storm gathering in the south. But they sleep safely because the man in the tower is awake. He has turned Moldavia into a coiled spring, tense and waiting. The tragedy of Dracula was that he fought as an individual against an empire, a contest of will that he was destined to lose. The genius of Stephen is that he is removing himself from the equation. He is making Moldavia itself the weapon. When the Ottomans finally decide to turn their gaze north, they will not be marching against a man. They will be marching against a system, a landscape, and a unified people. And as the mist rolls in again, covering the newly strengthened walls of Suceava, we can feel the weight of what is coming. The stone is set. The mortar is dry. The silence is about to end. The prince has built his stage. And soon, the greatest army in the world will step onto it, expecting a quick victory, only to find that the floor is trapped. The walls are closing in, and the playwright has written them a tragedy they never saw coming. The year turns, dragging the world towards the winter of 1474. The leaves have fallen from the oaks in the Carpathian foothills, leaving the branches bare and skeletal against a sky that is growing steadily darker, heavier, and more threatening. Down in the south, the great machine has finally started to move. The rumors that have been drifting up from Istanbul like smoke are no longer rumors. They are orders signed and sealed with the Tughra of the Sultan. Mehmed II, conqueror of empires, has decided that the nuisance in the north has persisted long enough. He does not come himself, not yet, but sends his most trusted general, Adem Suleiman Pasha, the eunuch, a man whose career is a tapestry of victories woven across Anatolia and Albania. Suleiman moves with the confidence of a man who commands the wind. He brings with him an army that defies the imagination of the peasant farmers watching from the riverbanks. Tens of thousands of regular troops, Sipahi cavalry in glittering armor, the terrifying Janissary Corps marching in lockstep, and a chaotic swarm of irregular Akinji raiders. It is a force designed to crush kingdoms, a moving city of tents, horses, and cannons that consumes everything in its path. They cross the Danube with the ease of a flood, breaching a dam, expecting the usual rhythm of conquest. A few skirmishes, a decisive battle in an open field, the surrender of the keys to the citadel, and the imposition of tribute. They expect a war of soldiers. What they find instead is a war of ghosts. Stephen does not ride out to meet them at the border. He does not line up his cavalry on the banks of the Danube to offer a glorious, futile resistance. Instead, he issues a command that is more painful than any defeat, a command that requires a hardness of heart that few rulers possess. He orders the country to consume itself. As the Ottoman vanguard pushes into Moldavia, they do not find the rich, fertile plains they were promised. They find ash. Stephen has initiated a scorched earth policy so total, so absolute, that it feels less like strategy and more like suicide. He orders the villages to be evacuated, the livestock driven into the deepest recesses of the mountains, and the granaries emptied. What cannot be carried is burned. Imagine the scene in a small Moldavian village, hours before the Turks arrive. There is no panic, only a grim, silent efficiency. Men are setting fire to the homes their grandfathers built. Women are dropping the carcasses of dead animals into the village wells, poisoning the water that sustained them for generations. They are destroying their own lives to save their souls, trusting that the prince in Suceava knows what he is doing. It is a covenant of destruction, a collective gamble that it is better to starve in the forest as free men than to eat in a land ruled by the crescent. When Suleiman Pasha's army arrives, the silence is deafening. The villages are smoldering ruins, the thatched roofs collapsed into piles of glowing embers that offer no warmth, only the acrid taste of charred wood. The fields are black scars on the snow-dusted earth. There is no fodder for the horses. There is no grain for the men. There is no water that does not carry the risk of sickness. The Ottoman logistical machine, usually a marvel of efficiency, begins to sputter. An army of 60,000 men, though historians still argue whether the number was as high as 120,000, factoring in camp followers and logistics personnel, is a beast with a voracious appetite. It needs tons of food every single day just to exist. Stephen has removed the food. He has turned the geography of Moldavia into a weapon of starvation. The invaders are forced to rely on their own supply lines, which are stretching thinner and thinner With every mile they march north, the roads are turning to slush, the wagons are breaking wheels in the frozen ruts, and the morale of the troops is beginning to fray. They are marching into a void, and the void is watching them. Stephen's light cavalry, the swift and deadly Halisha, hover on the edges of the Ottoman column like wolves shadowing a wounded bison. They do not engage in pitched battles. They strike at the foraging parties who strayed too far from the main body. They hit the supply wagons in the rear. They loose a volley of arrows from the tree line and vanish before the Janissaries can form a line. It is a war of 1,000 cuts. The Ottoman soldiers sleep in their armor, terrified of the shadows. They wake up tired, hungry, and cold, only to march another 20 miles through a desolate landscape that offers them nothing. The psychological toll is immense. In a traditional war, you can see your enemy. You can hate him, charge him, and kill him. Here, the enemy is the hunger in your belly and the cold seeping through your boots. The enemy is the emptiness. Suleiman Pasha, a commander of immense experience, begins to feel the trap closing, but his orders are clear, and his pride is vast. He cannot turn back because of empty barns. He pushes on, convinced that sooner or later, Stephen must stand and fight. He believes that no ruler can surrender his entire country to the torch without eventually breaking. He assumes Stephen is desperate. He is wrong. Stephen is not desperate. He is patient. He is trading space for time, trading barns for exhaustion. He is drawing the Ottoman army deeper and deeper into the funnel, pulling them away from their bases, away from their supplies, and leading them toward the place he has chosen. He knows the terrain better than he knows the lines on his own palm. He knows where the valley narrows. He knows where the marshes do not freeze solid, creating hidden traps of mud beneath the snow. He knows where the fog settles heaviest in the mornings. He is leading the great Ottoman host not just into a battlefield, but into a kill box. As the days shorten and the temperature plunges, the land of Moldavia seems to conspire with its prince. The rivers swell, slowing the crossing. The winds howl down from the Carpathians, biting through the thickest wool. The smoke from the burning villages hangs low in the air, a constant grey reminder that they are unwelcome. For the common Ottoman soldier, the glory of the campaign has evaporated. There are no rich cities to sack, no spoils to be won, only the endless march through the blackened snow. They begin to mutter among themselves. They say that this Prince Stephen is not a man, but a demon who eats smoke and drinks ice. They say that the land is cursed, but the drums beat on, driving them forward, step by agonizing step, toward the bridge at Vaslui. They do not know the name yet. To them, it is just another river crossing in a land of too many rivers. But Stephen is already there, waiting in the mist, watching the smoke of his own burning country drift south, a signal that the guests are arriving and the table is set. The sacrifice of the peasants, the burning of the harvest, the poisoning of the wells. It was all the price of admission for this moment. The land has done its work. It has weakened the giant, blinded him with hunger, and chilled his bones. Now, the time for burning is over. The time for steel has arrived. The scorched earth fades into the grey horizon, and the army marches blindly on, leaving a trail of frozen footprints that point only one way, toward the valley, where the fog waits to swallow them whole. The trap is not a steel cage. It is a valley of mud and mist. We drift now into the grey morning of January 10th, 1475, hovering over the confluence of the Rakova and Balad rivers. The landscape here is deceptive. In summer, it is a place of pastoral beauty, green and rolling, but in this strange, warm winter, it has transformed into a treacherous bog. The air is thick with a heavy, clinging fog that refuses to lift, a milky blindness that erases the horizon and reduces the world to a few yards of grey sludge in front of your face. Into this suffocating dampness marches the Ottoman vanguard. They are tired. They have walked through the scorched earth for weeks, their boots heavy with the clay of Moldavia, their spirits eroded by the lack of food and the constant silent hostility of the empty villages. They believe they are marching toward a decisive engagement, perhaps a siege of Suceava, or a clash on an open plain where their superior numbers can fan out and crush the smaller Moldavian force. They do not realize that the road they are on does not lead to a battlefield. It leads into the neck of a bottle. The geography of Vaslui is Stephen's greatest ally. Here the valley narrows significantly, squeezed between forested hills on either side and choked by the marshy floodplain of the river. It is a natural funnel. As the Ottoman army enters this corridor, their massive numerical advantage begins to evaporate. 60,000 men cannot fight 60 abreast here. They must stretch out into a long, thin, vulnerable column. Miles of soldiers trudging blindly forward, unable to see the rear or the front of their own formation. The discipline of the Janissaries, usually their greatest strength, becomes a liability as the mud sucks at their formations, breaking the perfect lines of the drill square. Listen to the sound of the march. It is not the rhythmic, terrifying thunder of boots on dry earth. It is a wet, sucking squelch, the sound of thousands of men fighting the ground itself. The wheels of the great bombards, the massive cannons that were dragged all the way from Istanbul to shatter stone walls, sink deep into the mire. Oxen bellow in frustration as they are whipped to pull the heavy guns through the slush. The fog dampens the sound, making the army feel strangely quiet, isolated within the white void. Commands shouted from the front do not reach the rear. The Sipahi cavalry, the proud knights of the empire, are neutralized. Their horses stumble in the marsh, their speed and mobility useless in a place where a trot is a risk and a gallop is impossible. Suleiman Pasha, riding somewhere in the center of this blind serpent, is confident but annoyed. He assumes Stephen is retreating. He assumes the Moldavians are running north, terrified of the might he brings. He does not know that he is not chasing a rabbit. He is walking into the open mouth of a wolf. Historians still argue whether Suleiman's scouts failed him, or if Stephen simply eliminated them before they could report back. The result is the same. The Ottomans are marching blind. They do not see the hills on either side of the valley. If the fog were to lift for just a moment, they would see that the forest is not empty. It is alive. Thousands of Moldavian peasants, armed with scythes, axes, and bows, are crouching in the tree line, motionless as the oak trees they hide behind. They are cold. They are terrified. But they are disciplined. They have been waiting for hours, perhaps days, watching the invaders trudge into the kill zone. Stephen is there too. He is not in a distant palace. He is watching from the high ground, perhaps atop the hill of Galbena, his eyes scanning the mist, waiting for the exact moment when the density of the enemy in the valley reaches the critical mass. He is measuring the flow of the river of men. He needs them all inside. He needs the vanguard to hit the blockage he has prepared at the bridge, the Podul Inalt, while the rearguard is still entering the valley. He is composing a symphony of chaos, and he is waiting for the musicians to take their seats. The atmosphere is heavy with a unique kind of dread, the dread of the unseen. The Ottoman soldiers, veterans of many campaigns, feel the hair on the back of their necks stand up. The silence of the woods feels unnatural. The fog feels too thick, too deliberate. They are walking through a ghost story. The sensory deprivation is almost total. A soldier can see the back of the man in front of him, the condensation dripping from his helmet, the mud splattered on his kaftan. But he cannot see the enemy. He cannot see the hills. He cannot see the escape route. He is trapped in a white room with 40,000 of his brothers, and the walls are closing in. To the front, the valley narrows further. The bridge over the Rakova River is a choke point, a bottleneck where the mud is deepest and the marsh most treacherous. It is here that the momentum of the march begins to stall. The vanguard slows down, struggling to cross. The men behind them bump into them, bunching up, creating a dense, disorganized mass of humanity. Arguments break out. Officers shout conflicting orders. The coherent army of the Sultan is dissolving into a mob of tired, wet men. And still, the forest says nothing. This is the mastery of Stephen's command, to keep an army of peasants and light cavalry silent while the enemy marches within shouting distance is a feat of leadership that rivals the battle itself. Every cough is stifled, every weapon checked to ensure it does not rattle. They are holding their breath, waiting for the signal. The tension stretches like a bowstring pulled to its absolute limit, quivering, ready to snap. The Ottomans are now fully committed. The tail of the serpent has entered the valley. There is no turning back, no room to maneuver, no way to deploy into battle formation. They are exactly where Stephen drew them on his maps months ago. They are in the mud, in the fog, in the winter, and in the trap. The trap is not just a location, it is a state of being. They are trapped in their own numbers, trapped by their own baggage train, trapped by the weather they ignored. The blind march is over. The army has arrived at its destination, though it is not the one they chose. The air in the valley seems to grow colder, sharper, as if the world is holding its breath. Then, somewhere in the mist, a sound cuts through the damp air. Not a cannon, not a shout, but a low, mournful tone that vibrates in the chest. It is the sound of a busium, the long wooden alphorn used by shepherds to call sheep across the mountains. But today, it is not calling sheep, it is calling the storm. The sound echoes off the invisible hills, distorted by the fog, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Ottoman soldiers stop. They look up into the grey void. The squelching of boots ceases. For a heartbeat, there is absolute silence in the valley of Vaslui. And then, the fog begins to turn red. The silence shatters, not with a scream, but with thunder. From the shrouded hills on either side of the valley, the Moldavian artillery speaks. Stephen has positioned his cannons perfectly, pre-sighted on the narrowest part of the bottleneck, where the Ottoman press is thickest. In the dense fog, the muzzle flashes are muffled, appearing only as sudden, terrifying blooms of orange light that pulse within the grey wall, like lightning trapped in a cloud. The cannonballs do not need to aim. They simply tear through the dense mass of men and horses, cutting chaotic lanes through the packed ranks. The effect is instantaneous and catastrophic. Because the Ottoman soldiers cannot see the gunners, they cannot fight back. They are being killed by the landscape itself. The psychological impact is far heavier than the iron. For the Janissaries, trained to look their enemy in the eye, this is a nightmare of helplessness. They turn to face the hills, raising their arquebuses. But there are no targets, only the indifferent mist and the roar of the next volley. Then the horns sound again, the buccium, joined now by trumpets and drums, creating a cacophony that seems to come from every direction at once. It is a sonic weapon, designed to disorient, to make the 40,000 Moldavians sound like 400,000. And then the forest moves. The trees seem to detach themselves from the shadows as Stephen's infantry and peasant levies charge down the slopes. They do not march. They rush, screaming, crashing into the flanks of the disorganized Ottoman column. The fighting is brutal, close quarters, and confused. In the mud, the heavy Ottoman armor becomes a tomb. A slip means death, trampled by your own comrades or finished by a peasant's axe. The grand formations of the empire, the disciplined lines that conquered Constantinople, dissolve into a frantic, shoving brawl. The panic begins at the bridge. The vanguard, hammering against the Moldavian shield wall on the far side of the Rakova, tries to fall back, but the rear guard, unaware of the slaughter ahead, is still pushing forward. The army begins to crush itself. Men are squeezed until they cannot breathe, lifted off their feet by the pressure of thousands of bodies panicking in unison. The bridge becomes a choke point of horror. Horses rear and plunge into the freezing river, dragging their riders down into the black water. The wooden planks, slick with ice and mud, become a slide into oblivion. The screams of men and beasts merge into a single, continuous wail that rises above the roar of the cannons. It is the sound of an organism in agony, an army realizing that it is dying. Suleiman Pasha, trapped in the center of the chaos, watches his command disintegrate. He tries to rally his Sipahis, shouting orders to form a defensive perimeter, but his voice is lost in the din. He sees his standard bearers cut down, their flags trampled into the slush. He realizes, with a sickening jolt, that his numerical superiority is meaningless. In fact, it is his enemy. His numbers are trapping him. The more men he has, the more targets the Moldavians have. The fog acts as a force multiplier for Stephen. Every Moldavian soldier appearing out of the mist seems like 10, striking and vanishing before a counterattack can be formed. The Ottomans are fighting ghosts who know exactly where to step, while they are stumbling blind into the mire. Stephen sends in his heavy cavalry now, the final hammer blow. They charge not into the center, but into the edges of the panic, peeling away the layers of the Ottoman army like skin from a fruit. The boyars, fighting for their land and their lives, strike with a ferocity that stuns the invaders. They know that if they lose here, there is no retreat, no mercy. This clarity of purpose cuts through the Ottoman confusion like a knife. The panic turns into a rout. The great army, the pride of the Sultan, breaks. It does not retreat in good order. It shatters. Men throw down their weapons, their shields, their honor, and run. They run back toward the Danube, back into the mud, back into the waiting arms of the scorched earth. But the trap has a second jaw. Stephen has destroyed the bridges behind them. As the mob of fleeing soldiers reaches the marshy ground they crossed days earlier, they find the way blocked by swollen streams and mud that is now churned into a liquid trap. The retreat becomes a massacre. The forest of the dead that Dracula created was a static, silent horror. This is a kinetic, screaming horror. It is the total collapse of a superpower's projection of force. In the span of a few hours, the myth of Ottoman invincibility in the north is drowned in the mud of Vaslui. The fog begins to lift slowly, as if the curtain is rising to reveal the tragedy on the stage. The valley is no longer white. It is a tapestry of ruin. Suleiman Pasha escapes, barely, fleeing on a fast horse, leaving his army, his reputation, and his honor in the mud. He rides south, his mind reeling, trying to compose the letter he must write to the Sultan. How does one explain this? How do you tell the conqueror of the world that his army was not beaten by a greater force, but by a fog, a bridge, and a prince who fought like a mathematician? The battle is over, but the shockwave is just beginning. This was not a raid. This was not a skirmish. This was the annihilation of a field army. The bodies lie in heaps, blurring the line between the river and the bank. The banners of Islam, which had flown over the walls of Byzantium, now lie rotting in a Moldavian swamp. Stephen does not chase the fleeing Pasha immediately. He remains on the field, watching the end of the slaughter with that same terrifying stillness. He knows what he has done. He has bought time. He has proven that the dragon can be bled. But he also knows that the dragon will be angry. Dracula poked the beast and ran. Stephen has cut off its paw. As the sounds of battle fade into the groans of the wounded and the sullen quiet of the evening, the magnitude of the victory settles over the valley. It is a victory of intelligence over brute strength, of geography over numbers. It is the proof that a small state, led by a mind that understands the nature of fear and terrain, can stand against the tide. The sun sets on a changed world. The Ottoman Empire is still vast, still powerful, still dangerous, but it is no longer inevitable. The fear has shifted. It has migrated from the hearts of the Moldavians to the hearts of the Turks. They will remember Vaslui. They will remember the fog. And they will learn to fear the name of Stephen, not because he impales them, but because he defeats them. The night falls, freezing the mud into hard, jagged ridges, locking the dead into the earth. The silence returns, but it is a different silence now. It is the silence of a gravedigger who has finished his work. The panic at the bridge has ended, but the echo of it will ring in the ears of the Sultan for the rest of his life. The news travels faster than the wind, carried by exhausted couriers, changing horses at muddy way stations, crossing the Carpathian passes, where the snow is still deep, and galloping onto the plains of Hungary and Poland. It moves like a shock wave, invisible but palpable, rippling outward from the carnage at Vaslui, until it washes up against the stone walls of the great capitals of Christendom. At first, the reports are met with silence, the heavy, skeptical silence of kings and cardinals who have grown accustomed to reading only tragedy from the East. For decades, the dispatches from the Balkans have been a monotonous litany of defeat. Serbia fallen, Bosnia conquered, Constantinople lost, the Aegean Islands swallowed one by one. The Ottoman advance seemed as inevitable as the setting sun. So when the first letters arrive in Buda, in Krakow, in Venice, and finally in Rome, claiming that the invincible army of the Sultan has not just been checked, but annihilated by a minor prince in a muddy valley, the initial reaction is disbelief. It feels like a rumor, a desperate fantasy concocted by a frightened people. But then come the proofs. The captured standards of the Ottoman regiments arrive, their silk torn and stained, paraded through the streets of foreign cities. The prisoners follow, lines of sullen men in foreign garb, visible evidence that the ghost story is true. And suddenly, the silence breaks. It breaks into a pealing of bells that starts in the spires of Suceava and rolls westward, jumping from parish to parish, cathedral to cathedral, until the air over Europe vibrates with the sound of the Te Deum. In Rome, Pope Sixtus IV, a man weighed down by the terror of an Italian invasion, receives the news with a relief that borders on ecstasy. He pens a letter that will echo through history, bestowing upon Stephen a title that carries the weight of a crusade. Atleta Christi, the champion of Christ. For a brief, shining moment, Stephen of Moldavia is the most famous man in the world. He is the toast of the Venetian Senate, where shrewd merchants calculate that their trade routes might remain open a little longer. He is the hero of the Polish court, where the nobles drink to the health of their neighbor, who has so conveniently secured their southern flank. But let us leave the celebrations and drift back to the man himself. While Rome sings and Venice counts its gold, Stephen is not celebrating. He is sitting in his citadel, reading the flowery letters of congratulation with a cold, cynical eye. He sees the disconnect that historians still argue was the fatal flaw of Christendom. The West loved the idea of a victory, but they had no interest in paying for the war. Stephen holds the title of champion in his hands, but he knows you cannot build a wall with titles. You cannot load a cannon with praise. He sends urgent missives back to the princes who are currently toasting his name. His letters are not boastful. They are desperate warnings written in the clear, sharp prose of a man who sees the storm on the horizon. The pagan emperor will not rest, he writes. He will come back, and he will come back himself, and he will come back with everyone. He begs for soldiers, for money, for a unified front. He tells them that Moldavia is the gate to Europe, and if the gate falls, the house will follow. The tragedy of this moment is palpable. We watch as the ambassadors of Europe nod politely, praise his valor, and then check their treasuries. The King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, a great warrior in his own right, but jealous of Stephen's rising star, offers little tangible help. The King of Poland offers vague promises. The Italian city-states send warm regards. Stephen realizes the bitter truth. He is the shield of Europe, but the arm holding the shield is entirely his own. The bells ringing in Rome are not for him. They are for the relief of the Italians. They are celebrating that the wolf has been stopped at someone else's door. Stephen is left alone with the glory, which is heavy, and the bodies, which are freezing in the valley of Vaslui. He knows Mehmed II. He knows the Sultan's psychology. Mehmed is not a man who accepts humiliation. The defeat at Vaslui is not a deterrent. It is an insult. It demands an answer in blood. Stephen knows that by destroying Suleiman Pasha's army, he has not ended the war. He has escalated it. He has forced the Sultan to take personal command. The next time the drums sound in the south, it will not be a general coming. It will be the conqueror himself. And so, while Europe parties, Stephen goes back to work. He replenishes his gunpowder. He repairs the walls of Neams and Suceava. He sends spies south to watch the assembling of a new, even larger host. The champion of Christ is essentially a sentry standing alone on the ramparts, while the rest of the castle sleeps off a drunken stupor. The atmosphere in the Moldavian court shifts from relief to a grim determination. The boyars, who might have thought the war was won, see their prince's face and stop smiling. They realize that Vaslui was just the opening move of a much darker game. Stephen begins to leverage his fame for diplomacy, trying to knit together an alliance that can withstand the full weight of the empire. But it is like trying to hold water in a sieve. The jealousies and rivalries of the Christian princes are too deep. They fear Stephen almost as much as they fear the Turks. If he becomes too powerful, will he turn on them? So they give him just enough praise to keep him fighting, but not enough power to make him secure. This is the loneliness of the competent. Stephen stands in the chapel of the Patna monastery, which he is expanding, and prays not for victory, but for endurance. The incense smoke rises to the painted dome, curling around the faces of the saints, who look down with impassive eyes. He understands now that his legacy will not be one of final triumph, but of perpetual resistance. He is the stone in the shoe of the giant. The bells of Rome fade into the distance, replaced by the sound of the blacksmith's hammer in Suceava, forging new swords. The snow melts, the spring comes, and the roads dry out. The echoes in the courts of Europe die away, leaving only the silence of the waiting East. The letters from the kings are filed away in the archives, their wax seals cracking. They are paper shields. The real shield is the determination of the Moldavian people, who look at their prince and see a man who does not believe in his own myth. He knows that myths don't stop arrows. Only preparation does. The summer of 1476 is approaching, and the dust is already rising in the south. The Sultan is coming, and he is bringing the whole world with him. The winter lifts, the mud dries, and the green canopy of the Moldavian forests returns. But the relief is an illusion. The year is 1476, and the summer sun brings with it a heat that shimmers off the horizon, distorting the air and carrying the taste of dust. The silence of the north is about to be broken by a noise louder than thunder. The Sultan has kept his promise. Mehmed II, the man who turned the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, the Caesar of Rome in all but name, is marching north. He does not come alone. He brings the full terrifying weight of the imperial center. Over 100,000 men, a train of artillery that stretches for miles, and the elite guard of the Janissaries, marching under the white horsetail standards of the sovereign. This is not a punitive expedition. It is an erasure. The sheer scale of the invasion is designed to suffocate hope. The earth trembles under the rhythmic stomp of the columns, a vibration felt long before the first turban is seen. Stephen stands in the forests of Razboyeni, watching the dust cloud rise in the south like a second, darker storm front. He is alone in a way he was not at Vaslui. The allies he petitioned, the kings who drank to his health in the comfortable halls of Buda and Krakow, have not come. The promised crusading armies are phantoms. He has only his Moldavians, perhaps 12,000 hardcore veterans, and a levy of peasants, facing a force 10 times their number. The tactical genius of Vaslui, the fog, the marshes, the winter, cannot be summoned in the dry heat of July. There is no trap to spring, no muddy bottleneck to exploit. There is only the forest, the heat, and the grim mathematics of attrition. Stephen makes the only choice a king can make when the end of the world arrives. He chooses where to bleed. He orders his men to dig in, to fell trees, and create a fortified encampment within the woods, turning the forest itself into a wooden castle. The battle that follows at Valea Alba, the White Valley, is not a masterpiece of maneuver like Vaslui. It is a brawl in a burning room. On July 26th, the Ottoman vanguard crashes into the Moldavian defenses. The fighting is claustrophobic and savage. The Janissaries, eager to wash away the shame of the previous year, charge directly into the defensive lines, climbing over the tangle of felled oaks and sharpened stakes. The Moldavians fight with the desperate ferocity of men defending their own doorsteps. They pour fire from hand cannons and arrows into the mass of attackers. But for every Turk who falls, 3 more step over his body. The Sultan himself, seeing his troops waver in the face of such suicidal resistance, rides into the fray, his presence acting as a galvanic shock to his army. The image of the emperor risking his life shames the Janissaries into a frenzy. The forest begins to burn. The Ottomans set fire to the barricades, and the battle becomes a vision of hell. Smoke choking the defenders, the crackle of flames mixing with the screams of the dying, and the relentless, grinding pressure of the Ottoman numbers. Stephen fights until the position is untenable. He loses the flower of his nobility that day. The old boyars, the men who had stood with him since his coronation, die in the burning woods so that their prince can escape. And escape he does. Stephen does not seek a glorious death. He knows that a dead hero leaves a conquered country. He slips away into the twilight, beaten, his army shattered, his friends dead. Technically, it is a crushing Ottoman victory. The road to Suceava is open. The army of Moldavia effectively ceases to exist as a coherent fighting force. Mehmed II stands on the battlefield, the smoke stinging his eyes, surrounded by the corpses of thousands of Moldavians. By the logic of medieval warfare, the war is over. The prince is beaten. The capital should surrender. The keys should be brought on a velvet cushion. Mehmed waits, but nothing happens. The silence returns to the forest, but it is not the silence of submission. It is the silence of emptiness. As the Ottoman army moves deeper into the country, seeking food, seeking plunder, seeking someone to surrender to them, they find only the same scorched earth that defeated Suleiman Pasha. The grain is gone. The wells are dry or poisoned. The villages are ash. Stephen may have lost his army, but he has not lost his population. They have vanished into the Carpathians, taking the soul of the country with them. The Sultan has conquered a graveyard. He marches on the capital, Suceava. He expects to find a terrified garrison ready to open the gates. Instead, he finds the gates locked and the walls bristling with defiance. He marches to Neamt, another key fortress. The story goes that Stephen's mother refused to let her fleeing son into the castle, telling him to go back and gather a new army. But whether myth or fact, the reality is that the fortresses do not yield. Mehmed lays siege, but his army is already suffering. The heat, the lack of water, and the plague that begins to ripple through the camp are enemies his cannons cannot fight. He is a master of sieges, but he is trying to besiege a ghost. Stephen is out there, somewhere in the north, and rumors begin to swirl that he is raising a new host, drawing men from the very stones of the mountains. The victory at the White Valley begins to sour in the Sultan's mouth. He has won the battle, but he is losing the campaign. He is bleeding resources to hold a land that gives him nothing in return. No food, no taxes, no peace. His supply lines are harassed by the remnants of Stephen's light cavalry, who refuse to accept that they are beaten. It is a lesson in the difference between military victory and political victory. Dracula was defeated because his power was brittle. Once his army broke, his state crumbled. Stephen's power is elastic. You can crush his army, burn his forests, and occupy his valleys. But the state, the idea of Moldavia, remains intact. Weeks pass. The Ottoman army, the greatest in the world, begins to starve in the midst of its triumph. The grandeur of the invasion fades into the misery of dysentery and hunger. Mehmed II, the man who redrew the map of the world, looks at the green hills of Moldavia and realizes he cannot hold them. The cost is too high. The friction is too great. With the approach of autumn and the threat of the Polish king finally mobilizing an army to the north, the Sultan makes the bitter decision. He orders the retreat. He leaves behind a battlefield so carpeted with the bones of the dead that it will forever be known as Valea Alba, the White Valley. It is a monument to the ferocity of the resistance. But as the Ottoman columns turn south, marching back towards the Danube without the tribute or the submission they came for, the truth becomes clear. Stephen lost the battle, but he won the argument. He proved that Moldavia could be burned, but not digested. The Sultan rides away, leaving the conquered prince to emerge from the mountains, walk back into his capital, and begin once again the slow, quiet work of rebuilding. The fear of Stephen has deepened. It is no longer just fear of his tactical skill. It is fear of his resilience. He is the man who can lose everything and still win. We climb now, leaving the smoking ruin of the White Valley and ascending into the cool, thin air of the Carpathian foothills. Here, perched on a rocky crag, like a stone crown fused to the mountain itself, stands the Setatea Neamțului, the fortress of Neamț. It is a place of vertigo and silence, where the walls seem to grow organically out of the cliffs, imposing and grey against the summer sky. This is the heart of Stephen's defensive system, the anchor that was designed to hold when the rest of the ship has been torn away by the storm. It is late summer, 1476. The Sultan Mehmed II, frustrated by a victory that felt like a defeat, has brought his army here. He needs a symbol. He needs to crack one of these stone nuts to prove that Moldavia is truly conquered. He brings his great bombards, the bronze monsters that shattered the triple walls of Constantinople, dragging them up the steep, winding paths with the sweat of thousands of oxen and the blood of captive slaves. The forest below the citadel is chopped down to clear lines of fire, transforming the pristine wilderness into a scarred, uglier siege camp, buzzing with the activity of engineers, gunners, and soldiers who are already sick, hungry, and tired of this endless war. There is a legend here, a story that every Romanian child learns, which hangs over this moment like a ghost. It tells of Stephen, defeated and demoralized after the White Valley, riding alone to the gates of Neamț. He is wounded, his armor battered, seeking refuge in his own castle. But the gates do not open. Instead, his mother appears on the ramparts, a figure of iron will, and refuses him entry. "Go back to your army," she cries. "Die for your country if you must, but do not come here as a fugitive. Winners return to the fortress, losers return to the field." It is a powerful, cinematic moment, a scene of Spartan virtue that perfectly encapsulates the myth of the national hero. But history tells a quieter, more impressive truth. Stephen likely never came to the gate during the siege. He didn't have to. The genius of Stephen was not that he had a harsh mother. but that he had built a machine that could function without its operator. He was busy in the north, gathering a new army, desperate and sleepless, while the fortress of Names fought on its own. The gates remained shut, not because his mother locked him out, but because the garrison inside, commanded by loyal Parkalab's governors, knew their duty was to hold the line, regardless of whether the prince was alive or dead. The siege begins with a roar that shakes the granite foundations of the mountain. The Ottoman cannons belch fire, sending heavy stone balls crashing against the walls. Clouds of dust and splinters of rock explode into the air, raining down on the defenders. But Neams is not Byzantium. It is smaller, compact, and positioned at an angle that makes direct fire difficult. The balls glance off the curved bastions or bury themselves harmlessly in the thick earthworks. Inside, the defenders are calm. They are well stocked. They have water. And they have something the Ottomans do not. They are home. They look down from the parapets at the sprawling Ottoman camp and see an army that is slowly dissolving. The heat of August in a closed valley is a silent killer. The streams are muddy and foul. The air in the Ottoman camp is thick with flies and the smell of sickness. The conqueror of the world is watching his invincible janissaries die not by the sword, but by the flux. Historians still argue whether the defense of Neams was turned by a specific stroke of luck. A German prisoner in the dungeon who purportedly directed the Moldavian cannons to destroy the Ottoman guns, or simply by the sheer impregnability of the site. But the effect is the same. The Ottomans bombed the walls for days, wasting powder, wasting shot, and wasting time. Every day they sit before Neams is a day the Polish king gets closer to mobilizing. Every day is a day Stephen recruits another 100 peasants in the mountains. The static nature of the siege works against the invaders. The Ottomans rely on momentum, on terror, on the swift collapse of enemy morale. But stone does not feel terror. The walls of Neams do not panic. They simply stand there, grey and indifferent, absorbing the blows and offering nothing in return. Mehmed II stands by his tent, looking up at the fortress. He is a man of immense intelligence, a scholar warrior who reads ancient Greek texts and draws maps of the world. He calculates the cost. He sees his supply lines stretching back to the Danube like a frayed rope. He sees the winter coming, the Moldavian winter that ate Suleiman Pasha's army whole. He realizes that taking this castle will cost him more men than he can afford to lose. And even if he takes it, he cannot hold it. It is a rock in the middle of a hostile ocean. To capture Neams would be a victory of vanity, not strategy. The silence of the fortress is mocking him. It is a silence that says, "You may break the army in the field, but you cannot break the land itself." The order is given quietly. There is no final, glorious assault, no storming of the breach. There is only the sullen packing of tents, the hitching of oxen to the gun carriages, and the slow, bitter turning of backs. The Ottoman army begins the long march home. They leave behind the scorched earth, the empty villages, and the defiant fortresses. As they retreat, the conquered land comes alive again behind them. The peasants emerge from the forests to harass the rearguard. The light cavalry snaps at their heels. The retreat becomes a harrowing gauntlet of hunger and ambush. The Sultan returns to Istanbul not as a conqueror of Moldavia, but as a man who survived it. He has burned the country, yes, but he has failed to extinguish the flame. Up on the walls of Neams, the defenders watch the dust settle. There is no wild cheering, only the weary relief of men who have stared into the abyss and seen it blink. They have proven that the apocalypse is not inevitable. They have proven that if you build your walls thick enough and your will strong enough, even the tide must eventually recede. The gates finally open, not to admit a fleeing prince, but to let the fresh air into the smoke-filled courtyard. The legend of the mother may be a story, but the reality of the fortress is a lesson in statecraft. Stephen had prepared his country so thoroughly that it could fight the greatest power on earth to a standstill, even when he wasn't there to give the orders. The stone of Neams is still there today, a silent witness to the summer when the world came to end Moldavia, and Moldavia simply refused to end. The immediate crisis has passed, but the war is not over. The Ottomans are gone, but they will remember. And Stephen, emerging from the wilderness with a new army, knows that the sword cannot be sheathed. He has survived the flood, but now he must learn to live on the shore of a dangerous sea, forever watching the horizon. The military phase of his struggle peaks here, in the survival of 1476. Now the game changes. The cannon is replaced by the quill. The battlefield expands from the valleys of Moldavia to the chancelleries of Europe. We move from the age of heroic resistance to the age of the lonely watchman. The roar of the cannons at Neams fades into the past, replaced by a sound that is quieter but infinitely more treacherous: the scratching of a quill against parchment. We have moved from the battlefield to the council chamber, from the open air of the mountains to the stifling, shadow-filled rooms of diplomacy. The year is drifting toward 1484, and Stephen is no longer the young, ruddy-faced warrior who charged into the mud at Vaslui. His hair is graying, his old wounds ache when the weather turns cold, and his eyes have taken on the hard, flat look of a man who has seen every promise broken. The War of Steel has become a war of ink. Stephen sits at a heavy oaken table in Suceava, surrounded by maps that are constantly changing. To his south lies the Ottoman giant, now ruled by Sultan Bayezid II, a man less aggressive than his father Mehmed, but arguably more dangerous because he is patient. To the north and west lie Poland and Hungary, the Christian brothers who accepted Stephen's homage, drank his wine, and promised him armies that never arrived. Stephen looks at the chessboard of Europe and realizes the terrifying truth that haunts every small nation. He is not a player. He is a piece. But he is a piece that refuses to be taken off the board. He decides that if he cannot be the queen, he will be the most difficult, stubborn pawn in the history of the game. The tragedy of this era is the betrayal of the Black Sea. For decades, the prosperity of Moldavia, and indeed its utility to the West, relied on two great fortresses, Chilia and Cetatea Alba. These were the lungs of the country, the ports where the Genoese merchants docked, where the grain flowed out and the gold flowed in. In the summer of 1484, the Ottomans finally moved to pinch these arteries shut. They do not march through the mud this time. They come by sea and land, a coordinated strike designed to strangle Moldavia's economy. Stephen, as always, rides to the defense, but he is outnumbered, and more importantly, he is alone. He sends frantic letters to King Casimir of Poland, his nominal suzerain. "The Turk is at the gate," he writes, the ink practically vibrating with urgency. "If these ports fall, they fall not just for me, but for you." He waits. He watches the horizon, But the Polish lances do not appear. The Hungarian Black Army does not march. The West is busy with its own squabbles, its own dynastic feuds, and its own indifference. The ports fall. The keys to the Black Sea are handed to the Sultan, and the Moldavian lake becomes an Ottoman pond. It is a blow that would have broken a lesser man. To lose your economic heart, to watch your allies stand by and whistle while your house is robbed, is a bitterness that poisons the soul. But this is where Stephen separates himself from the romantic tragedy of a figure like Dracula. Vlad would have lashed out. He would have raided a border town, impaled a few thousand peasants, and screamed his rage at the sky until the inevitable end. Stephen does something far colder and more difficult. He swallows his pride. He looks at the map, calculates the odds, and realizes that the era of total war is over. He cannot defeat the Ottoman Empire militarily without allies, and allies do not exist. So, he must defeat them politically. He begins a delicate, dangerous dance of rapprochement. Historians still argue whether Stephen's decision to eventually resume paying tribute to the Porte was a moment of defeat or his greatest strategic victory. It looks like submission, the gold coins counted out, the ambassador bowing before the Sultan. But look closer. It is not the submission of a conquered province. It is the protection money of a sovereign state. Stephen agrees to pay the harak, the tribute, in exchange for a guarantee. The Ottomans will not occupy Moldavia. They will not build mosques in Suceava. They will not administer the laws. The prince will remain the prince. The church will remain the church. And the army will remain Moldavian. It is a pragmatic bargain. He is buying autonomy with gold. He is kissing the hand he cannot bite off, but he is keeping his teeth. This nuance is lost on the critics of his time, who whisper that the champion of Christ has sold out. They do not see that Stephen is playing a game of centuries. He understands that empires rise and fall, but the nation must survive. If he fights to the death, Moldavia becomes a pashalik, erased from the map like Bulgaria or Serbia. If he pays, Moldavia survives in a coma, perhaps, but alive. Alive to wake up another day. The atmosphere in the court becomes heavy with intrigue. Stephen is now the old lion, surrounded by younger boyars who do not remember the glory of Vaslui, only the taxes of today. He has to be ruthless. He executes traitors, not with the theatrical flair of Dracula, but with the quiet efficiency of a gardener pruning dead branches. He trusts no one. He plays Poland against Hungary, Hungary against the Turks, and the Turks against the Tatars. He marries his children into the royal houses of Moscow and Mangub, casting nets of influence as far as he can, trying to anchor his small ship in a storm that never ends. We see him late at night, rubbing his tired eyes, dictating yet another letter to the Pope, to the Venetians, to the Muscovites. The language is polite, flowery, diplomatic, but the subtext is always the same. I am still here. Do not forget me. This is a different kind of heroism. It is not the heroism of the charge. It is the heroism of the ulcer. It is the stress of holding a roof up when the pillars are rotting. It is the heroism of eating bitterness daily, so that your children do not have to eat dirt. The Ottomans, for their part, come to respect this old man in the north. They realize that Moldavia is a hornet's nest that is not worth crushing. It is cheaper to take the gold and let the old wolf rule his own den. They fear Stephen not because he can destroy them, he can't, but because he makes everything so incredibly difficult. He is the friction that slows the imperial machine. He represents a limit to their power. As the 1490s approach, the chessboard settles into a stalemate. The borders are diminished, the ports are gone, but the heartland remains. The churches are still being built. Stephen's famous promise to build a monastery for every victory has filled the valleys with painted sanctuaries, beautiful jewels of Byzantine art that serve a dual purpose. They are houses of God, yes, but they are also cultural fortresses, assertions of identity that the Ottomans cannot tax or confiscate. The blue frescoes of Voronezh shine in the sun, a defiant splash of color against the grey geopolitical reality. They are Stephen's final message to the future. We were here. We believed. We survived. The section ends not with a bang, but with a weary sigh. The diplomats pack up their scrolls. The spies slip back into the shadows. The king is tired. He has navigated the treacherous waters of treason and ambition, and he has brought the ship of state into a harbor. It is not the harbor of total victory he dreamed of as a youth, but it is a harbor where the ship is still afloat. And in the wreckage of Eastern Europe, where kingdoms are vanishing like smoke, staying afloat is the only victory that matters. The noise of the cannon and the scratching of the diplomat's quill have both faded now, replaced by a sound far more intimate and unsettling, the ragged, labored breathing of an old man in a stone room. We have journeyed through the mud of Vaslui, the fire of the White Valley, and the cold intrigue of the council chambers. And now we arrive at the final fortress, the body of the prince himself. It is the summer of 1504. The air in the princely chambers of Suceava is thick with the scent of beeswax candles, dried sage, and the metallic, sickly sweet odor of decaying flesh. Stephen, the man who broke the Janissaries and outlasted the sultans, is fighting a battle he cannot win. He lies in a heavy wooden bed, his body shrunken, his face a map of deep lines carved by 47 years of vigilance. He is waiting, but he is not waiting for an ambassador or a general. He is waiting for the end of pain. The wound that defines these final years is not a metaphor. It is a literal festering injury on his leg, a souvenir from the siege of Chilia nearly 42 years ago. It has never truly healed, a constant throbbing reminder that every victory extracts a toll from the victor. For decades, he ignored it, riding through the pain, forcing his body to serve his will. But now, the debt has come due. The room is crowded with shadows and the hushed whispers of men who are terrified of what happens when the breathing stops. The best doctors money can buy have been summoned from Venice and Genoa. We see them huddled in the corner, speaking in low, rapid Italian, arguing over texts of Galen and Avicenna. Among them is Matteo Muriano, a physician sent by the Doge, who looks at the prince's leg with a grim expression. The treatment they propose is brutal, a reflection of an age where medicine was often indistinguishable from torture. They suggest cauterization, burning the infection with hot iron. Historians still argue whether this final, agonizing procedure was a desperate attempt to save him that accidentally hastened his death, or if the infection had already become systemic, rendering any intervention futile. Regardless of the medical truth, the image is searing. The champion of Christ, the old lion of the north, gripping the sides of his bed, refusing to scream as the fire touches his flesh. He endures this pain with the same stoic, terrifying silence that he maintained at Vaslui. He does not fear the iron. He fears only that he has not done enough. Even in this twilight, the lion still has claws. Just 2 years prior, in 1502, sensing that the King of Poland was encroaching on Moldavian rights, the invalid prince had ordered his army to seize the region of Pocutia. It was a final, stunning snap of the jaws, a message to his neighbors that although the prince was dying, he was not dead yet. The Polish court, shocked that the sick man could still bite, backed down. It is a testament to the sheer force of his personality that even from his deathbed, he projects a field of deterrence that keeps the borders profound. The Ottomans, too, are watching. The spies in Istanbul report that the great infidel is fading. But Sultan Bayezid II does not order an invasion. He waits. The respect Stephen has earned is so deep that it acts as a metaphysical wall. The Sultan knows that disturbing the old wolf's final rest might bring down a curse, or worse, rally the Moldavians into a frenzy of grief and vengeance. So the empire holds its breath, acknowledging a truce imposed not by treaty, but by the mortality of a single man. Stephen knows this. He knows that his life is the only thing holding the dam against the flood. He calls for his son, Bogdan. Bogdan is a warrior, physically strong, but he lacks the nuance, the terrifying intellect of his father. He is known as Bogdan the One-Eyed, and later, the Blind. Stephen looks at him through the haze of fever and delivers his final political testament. It is not a speech about glory. He does not tell his son to crusade. He does not tell him to be a hero. He tells him to be a realist. The Turk is too strong, he whispers. You cannot fight the wind forever. He advises Bogdan to continue the tribute, to keep the peace he bought with his pride. It is a heartbreaking admission for a man who spent his life fighting, a final realization that the survival of the people is more important than the ego of the ruler. He is handing his son a poisoned chalice and teaching him how to sip from it without dying. He is bequeathing him the heavy, unglamorous burden of vassalage, knowing it is the only way to keep the churches standing and the language alive. The atmosphere in the room shifts as the end draws near. The boyars, the rough men who rode with him at the White Valley, the sons of the men who died for him at Vaslui, kneel by the bed. They are weeping. This is not the ceremonial grief of a court performing for the public. This is the genuine terror of a family losing its father. For nearly half a century, Stephen was the sun around which their entire world revolved. He was the law, the defense, the economy, and the conscience of Moldavia. Without him, they are just a small, vulnerable collection of valleys surrounded by hungry empires. They feel the cold wind of the future blowing through the cracks in the stone walls. They kiss his hand, the hand that held the sword, the hand that signed the treaties, the hand that built the monasteries. It is a hand that is now frail, spotted with age, trembling slightly on the velvet coverlet. Stephen closes his eyes. He drifts away from the pain, away from the doctors with their hot irons, away from the maps that he memorized better than his own face. He sees the mist of Vaslui again. He hears the bells of Putna. He sees the faces of his wives, his children, his friends who have gone before him. He wonders, perhaps, if it was worth it, the blood, the ash, the years of sleeping in the saddle. And then he listens. He listens to the silence outside the window. There are no Turkish drums, There are no screams of burning villages. There is only the wind in the trees and the sound of the church bells ringing for vespers. The country is at peace. The borders are secure. The cross is still on the dome. He has done it. He has held the door shut for 47 years. The old lion lets out a final long breath, a sigh that seems to carry the weight of the entire 15th century with it. The room goes still. The doctor lowers his head. The candle flickers and goes out. Stephen the Great is dead. But the fear he inspired, that does not die. It hangs in the air, a permanent shadow over the Danube, warning the world that this land was defended by a giant, and that his ghost is still watching from the ramparts of the monasteries, ready to wake if the silence is broken. The candle has been extinguished, but the room does not go dark. Instead, it is filled with a different kind of light, the long, steady twilight of memory that stretches across centuries. We stand now at the end of our journey, looking back through the corridor of time at the two shadows that fell across the Danube in the 15th century. On one side, there is the sharp, jagged silhouette of Vlad Dracula, the Impaler, the man who tried to scream his name into history with stakes and fire. On the other, there is the solid, immovable block of Stephen the Great, the man who wrote his name in stone and law. The world, in its love for the macabre, has chosen the scream. Dracula has become a global icon, a face on cereal boxes and Halloween costumes, a creature of cinema who drinks blood and fears the sun. But this is a hollow immortality. It is a fame divorced from reality, a caricature that mocks the tragic, desperate man who actually lived. The Ottomans, the very people Dracula tried so hard to terrify, forgot him quickly. To them, he was a Kazakh Bey, the impaling lord, a temporary madness that was cured with a new governor. His terror was like a flash of lightning, blinding for a second, but leaving the night exactly as dark as it was before. Stephen's legacy is harder to see from Hollywood, but it is felt in the bedrock of Eastern Europe. He did not become a monster. He became a saint. In the years following his death, the Ottoman Empire continued its expansion, eventually bringing Moldavia into its orbit. But the memory of the old lion changed the nature of that conquest. Historians still argue whether it was Stephen's military resistance or his diplomatic realism that truly saved Moldavia from being annexed as a direct Ottoman province, a pashalik. But the result is indisputable. Unlike Hungary, unlike Bulgaria, unlike Serbia, Moldavia was never fully dissolved. It kept its princes, it kept its laws, it kept its church. The Ottomans, remembering the mud of Vaslui and the forests of the White Valley, preferred to take a lighter tribute than to risk waking the sleeping giant again. They ruled Moldavia with a loose rein, fearing that if they pulled too hard, another Stephen might rise from the monasteries to meet them. This is the ultimate victory of the competent ruler. He projects power even from the grave. The fear of Stephen became a policy of respect. Walk today through the serene courtyard of the Bodna monastery. The air is cool and smells of pine and incense. Inside the church, under a canopy of white marble, lies the tomb of Stephen. It is not a place of horror. It is a place of profound peace. Pilgrims come here not to shudder, but to weep with gratitude. They touch the cold stone with trembling hands, whispering prayers to the man who ensured they could still pray in their own language. On the walls outside, the painted saints look down with the same eyes Stephen saw, the famous Moldavian blue, a color made from crushed lapis lazuli that has withstood 500 years of rain and snow. These monasteries are his true fortifications. The stone castles of Nayams and Suceava eventually fell into ruin or were dismantled by later, weaker princes at the command of the Turks. But the cultural fortresses, the painted churches, remained. They were the arcs that carried the identity of the people through the flood of history. Stephen understood what Dracula did not, that you cannot defend a people only with swords. You must give them something beautiful to defend. You must give them a soul. The contrast is final and absolute. Dracula fought for his throne. Stephen fought for the state. Dracula used terror to paralyze. Stephen used faith to mobilize. In the end, the Ottoman Empire, that pragmatic, ruthless machine, feared the builder more than the killer. They knew that a man who impales 20,000 people is a madman who will eventually destroy himself. But a man who builds 44 churches and wins 46 battles is a civilization. And civilizations are dangerous. They are hard to digest. They tend to stick in the throat of empires. We look down one last time at the map of Europe. The borders have changed 1,000 times since 1504. Empires have risen and turned to dust. The Ottoman sultans are gone. The kings of Poland are gone. But in the green hills of the Carpathians, the bells of Putna are still ringing. They ring the same tone they rang when the old lion was laid to rest. It is a sound that says, "We are still here." The mist begins to return now, not the fog of war, but the gentle, concealing mist of time. It rolls over the valley of Vaslui, covering the old bones and the rusted iron. It climbs the walls of Nayams, softening the jagged edges of the ruin. It drifts through the forests where the peasant archers once waited. The story is done. The fear has faded into history, and history has softened into legend. But it is a true legend, one made of earth and blood, not ink and fantasy. As we step back from the edge of the timeline, leaving the 15th century behind, we take with us the final lesson of the Danube. It is a lesson about the nature of fear. We are taught to fear the loud, the violent, the monstrous. But the true power, the power that changes the world, is quiet. It is the power of the man who prepares. It is the power of the man who builds. It is the power of the man who, when the entire world tells him to kneel, simply stands in the mud, waits for the fog to clear, and says, "No." The fire in the hearth has burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light across the room. The history books are closed, their heavy covers shutting out the noise of battles and the whispers of kings. The smoke has cleared from the valleys, and the snow has melted from the fields. All that remains is the quiet hum of the night, a silence that is not empty, but full of peace. You have walked a long way tonight. You have stood in the mud of the battlefield, sat in the councils of princes, and watched the candles burn low in the chambers of the dying. But now, it is time to let the past rest. The figures we met, Stephen, Mehmed, the soldiers in the mist, are sleeping now, wrapped in the blanket of centuries. They have done their work. They have fought their fights. You do not need to carry their burdens anymore. Feel the weight of the story lifting from your mind, floating away like a leaf on a slow-moving river. The tension of the siege is gone. The anxiety of the ambush is gone. There is only the safety of this moment, here, now. You are safe. The walls around you are strong. The night outside is gentle. Let your breathing slow down, matching the rhythm of a calm, steady world. Inhale the stillness. Exhale the day. The old lion is at rest, and his watch is over. Yours is over too. Let the darkness be a comfort, a soft velvet curtain drawn against the light. Sink into the warmth. Let the history fade into a dream, a story whispered by the wind to the trees. The world will still be there when you wake, but for now, there is only the quiet, sweet dreams